December the 1st, 1942. Outside Stalingrad, 4 kilometers northeast of Tractor Factory District. Snow 15 cm deep. Ambient temperature, minus 27 degrees C. The KV-1 tank was dead. Engine seized. Treads frozen. Radio broken. Smoke curled from the exhaust in short, apologetic bursts before fading into the wind. Inside, 4 men sat in silence, the kind that forms not from fear, but from the inevitability of failure. Outside, on his knees in the snow, hands deep in the engine housing with a wrench forged before the war, was Corporal Mikhail Arkipovich Gerasimov, a mechanic, 3rd class, with no rank above his name and no orders except to fix what could not be fixed. His face was pale, bloodless from exposure, fingertips raw beneath his gloves. The metal bit back when he touched it. Frost formed along the edge of the spanner as he tried for the 3rd time to loosen a fuel line that had fused into place with cold and corrosion. He didn't swear, didn't shiver, just breathed, slow and even, the way a man breathes when he's not thinking about pain but about geometry, the angle of stress on a bolt, the curve of an intake valve. Behind him, artillery thundered. It had been 8 hours since this particular KV had broken down. In that time, 2 tanks had passed. Neither stopped. They couldn't. The column had to keep moving or be shelled to pieces. Gerasimov had told the crew to wait, that he would fix it. When the commander, a man 20 years younger and shaking from adrenaline, asked with what parts, Gerasimov just said, "Whatever I have left." He had 1 half-destroyed fan belt from a T-34, a length of braided wire, and the inner coil spring from a destroyed German MG-34 that he'd pocketed out of habit 3 weeks earlier. He didn't know it yet, but that spring, 5 centimeters of curved metal, would keep 23 tanks moving through the winter of 1942. Before the war, Mikhail Gerasimov had repaired agricultural machines near Yaroslavl, diesel tractors, steam rigs, machines so old they didn't have manuals, just oral history passed down from one mechanic to the next. He wasn't trained. He learned by taking things apart. As a boy, he disassembled clocks and reassembled them, using only half the parts. His father once asked him why. "Because if it works with half," he'd said, "then we never needed the rest." By 1938, he could rebuild an engine from memory. By 1939, he was conscripted. He didn't fire a rifle until 1941. Even then, he preferred wrenches. Stalingrad's winter was a machine killer. Lubricants froze in their canisters. Oil turned to paste. Radiators cracked. Steel became brittle. Engines shrieked and died mid-rotation. Tank treads froze solid to the earth. Gearboxes seized. And worst of all, spare parts were gone. Entire repair columns had been shelled out of existence. Supply trains vanished into snowbanks, or worse, into German lines. By December, there were tanks everywhere, hulks frozen in place like statues of industrial extinction. Many were not destroyed by enemy fire, but by entropy. They simply stopped moving, and that was when Gerasimov made his decision. He would not wait for parts. He would make them. He started with tread bolts. Every tank that took damage lost some. Spares were gone. So he began salvaging rebar from collapsed buildings, using a blowtorch assembled from fuel siphoned off dead trucks and a flare tube to forge replacements. The first bolts snapped under tension. The second batch held. Soon other crews were requesting his threadless pins, as they were called. They looked like junk, bent, rough, hand-scorched. But they held treads in place long enough to reach the next depot. Then came the fuel injectors. The KV-1s used a unique fuel line configuration. When frozen, the pressure regulators failed. Normally, this would require full replacement, a part manufactured in Leningrad and no longer available. So Gerasimov fashioned tiny pressure valves from spent shell casings, trimming brass down to precise thicknesses with a hacksaw and refitting the lines with lengths of solid copper wire taken from German radio sets. When one commander demanded to know if he was mad for injecting enemy metal into Soviet machines, Gerasimov replied, "Better a red tank with a fascist's radio than a grave with a hammer and sickle." No one argued. The spring, the one from the MG-34, became a miracle. It started when Gerasimov realized the return coil inside the tank's rotary starter had failed. No spares, no way to start the engine. Until he remembered the tension of that little German spring, coiled tighter than any Soviet model. He flattened it, filed it, reshaped the tip with pliers and the edge of a rail tie, then installed it into the starter like it belonged. The tank roared to life. 2 days later, he found 5 more German guns in a supply cache. He took them all apart. "Tell command," he said. "We don't need spares, we need trash." Word spread. He was not famous, not even well-liked. He was quiet, spoke with a stutter and kept to himself. But his workshop and a collapsed farm shed held up with fence posts and tank hulls became a sacred place. Crews began dragging crippled machines to him under fire. He worked by moonlight, using a mirror to reflect beams from a shattered headlamp onto his workbench. He had no lathe, no proper forge, just heat, hands, and hunger. He fixed 11 tanks in the first 3 weeks of December. In January, he fixed 17 more. By the end of February, his name was spoken with reverence. But he didn't care. He only wanted machines to move. Because when machines moved, men lived. The workshop had no name, but among the tank crews who passed through the northeast corridor of the Stalingrad sector during that brutal winter, it became known as the Boneyard. Not because of the dead, though plenty of corpses had been dragged there over the weeks, but because of the metal, scavenged, splintered, cracked, fused. It reminded men of ribs, twisted and exposed in the cold. And at the center of it all was Mikhail Gerasimov, the mechanic without orders, without parts, and increasingly without sleep. He worked by rhythm, not by clock. There was no time for rest. If a machine could breathe again, it had to be now. The battle didn't pause for repairs. His hands were no longer the hands of a man, they were steel, not just metaphorically. He had burns across every knuckle, deep bruises that had never healed, and so many small embedded metal shavings in his fingers that the skin glittered faintly under lantern light. He didn't notice anymore. Pain had been traded away weeks ago in exchange for instinct. Sometimes he spoke to the tanks, not in poetry but in the quiet muttering of a man reciting the parts he needs before they break. Water pump. Not today. Right bearing rod. That'll give soon. Second tread plate. Left side. Loose. He could hear the future of failure in the vibration of a chassis being dragged through slush. By mid-January, word of his ability had traveled farther than the front. Field commanders began quietly rerouting disabled tanks toward his position. There was no formal recognition, no written directive, just whispers and crude arrows scratched into the sides of burned-out buildings, pointing to the shed where Gerasimov worked. He now had 2 apprentices, both younger than 20, neither trained. They handed him tools, carried buckets of heated oil, and kept the fire under the forge going. One of them, Sergei, asked him once how he knew what would work. Mikhail looked at the boy, blinked slowly, and said, "I don't. But machines want to run. You just have to give them permission." It was in late January that the real miracle happened. A T-34 arrived, dragging a shattered rear drive assembly. The final drive had been cracked by a mine, and the internal gear teeth were ground to powder. The part was unrepairable. In a depot with equipment it would take a week to replace. Out here it meant abandonment. Gerasimov sat beside the tank for nearly an hour, unmoving. He stared at the gear housing as if waiting for it to speak. Then he stood, walked to the wreckage pile behind the shed, and began pulling apart the turret ring of a destroyed BT-7. The dimensions didn't match. The teeth were all wrong. But he cut them anyway. He reshaped them with a hammer heated over open flame, remounted the assembly upside down, reversed the link engagement, and manually filed each gear point with the edge of a broken chisel. It took 2 nights and all of his strength. But the tank moved. When its commander tried to shake his hand, Gerasimov simply wiped his palms on his trousers and turned back to his forge. By early February, fuel was running low. Not just for engines, but for heat. Fires burned out quickly. Mechanics froze. Lubricants congealed. Metal cracked on contact. So he built a sealed oil recovery system from discarded cooking canisters, refitted with copper tubing stripped from artillery telephone wire. He used it to catch and reburn crankcase vapor, converting it back into heat. The device was unstable. It backfired constantly. Once it exploded. He rebuilt it again and again until it worked. His men called it the Dragon. It kept them warm enough to keep working. Everything he touched became something else. In late February, a tank crew arrived in desperation, their vehicle dead with a seized transmission. The driver wept. His brother was still trapped inside. Mikhail climbed in, cleared away the frost from the inner compartment, and felt the frozen shaft with bare hands. It should have cut him, it didn't. He exhaled once, then took a length of braided electrical wire and wrapped it around the drive shaft, tying the loose ends to a crank fashioned from a fence post and a meat hook. It wasn't mechanical advantage, it was leverage born of lunacy, and it worked. The tank started again. The brother survived. No one knew how. No one asked. They just said later, Gerasimov turned it with his will. That was the kind of man he had become. He never slept more than 2 hours. When he did, it was curled up next to the furnace, tools still in hand, dreaming of engine compression and ignition sequences. Sometimes he muttered part numbers in his sleep. Other times he whispered names, machines, not people, the KV, the T-26, the BT, each one a living memory of what he had refused to bury. He began keeping a journal, not of words, but of sketches, pages filled with diagrams, notes, estimated measurements, solutions invented in the moment and never to be repeated. He had no paper, so he used the backs of German propaganda leaflets dropped by the Luftwaffe. On one, a swastika still showed faintly through a pencil sketch of a repurposed cooling fan made from bicycle spokes and helmet straps. His solutions were madness, but they worked. He stopped waiting for command to issue orders. If a tank came, he fixed it. If no tank came, he walked to the line and dragged one back. Once he did so under sniper fire. Another time, he and his apprentices towed a disabled light tank with only 2 planks and a rope, then refitted it using a radio antenna mast as a steering linkage. The tank made it 30 more kilometers before finally dying for good. He told no stories, gave no speeches. But by the end of February, a company commander remarked in a letter to his superior that there is a mechanic near Grid 4B who repairs the impossible. We don't know what to call him. He just fixes. And that was the truth. He didn't lead men. He led machines. Because in a war where bullets never stopped and fuel was more precious than blood, the man who made engines breathe again was more valuable than any general. They say that by spring, over 30 tanks that should have been written off were still moving because of him. They say he died quietly, of frostbite and exhaustion, sometime in March, after finishing one last repair on a tank he never saw move again. But some say he didn't die at all, that he walked into the fog after the snow melted, engine grease still on his coat, whispering to machines long since gone silent, that he became a ghost of gears and resolve, that he waits for the next broken tank in the next unwinnable war. Because no matter the time or place, the world always needs someone insane enough to make the dead move again. By the time the snow began to recede in the outskirts of Stalingrad, the Germans had lost their grip on the eastern districts. The front shifted slowly, meters at a time. But in the spaces between shell impacts and skirmishes, something more quiet and more improbable was unfolding. Machines that should not have moved were still crawling forward. Broken tanks with mismatched armor, re-welded barrels, and engine compartments held together with barbed wire and scrap metal were still participating in the war. They had no right to. And yet there they were, roaring, shuddering, lurching over ruined streets, with the stubborn heartbeat of machines that refused to stay dead. One of them, a T-34 with a reconditioned German transmission, was so irregular in sound that it drew fire from both sides of the front, each thinking it was enemy. The driver, a wiry young man named Makarov, had to paint the words, "Don't shoot, stolen parts," on the side in chalk. The tank survived 2 weeks of combat before the turret jammed from overuse. When asked how it had lasted so long, Makarov simply said, "Gerasimov gave it his anger." There were many like that, no 2 tanks the same, each one a Frankenstein of welded desperation and mechanical defiance. Some had treads from 2 different models, others had suspension arms made from the cut-down frames of farm carts. A few had their starter cranks replaced by crowbars or bayonets. They shouldn't have worked. They didn't work well, but they moved. And in war, motion is victory. The men who operated them became known as the Wolves of the Boneyard. Not official. Just a name muttered between teeth behind clouds of diesel exhaust. These were crews who had been pulled from the mud by Gerasimov's madness. They carried no medals. Their tanks were never shown in the papers, but they were always the ones sent to hold the broken ground. Because if their machines broke again, they could fix them, or at least try. And that in the chaos of total war was everything. One day in mid-March, a column of tanks arrived at the former repair shed, now buried half in snow, half in ash. The roof had collapsed during a mortar strike the week before. Inside, the fire pit was still hot. Mikhail was not there. His two apprentices were silent, hunched over a disassembled gearbox with grease-blackened hands and hollow eyes. When the officer in charge asked where the mechanic was, one of the boys said simply, "He went walking, said he had a promise to keep." No one saw him again. But 3 days later, 50 kilometers south, near a frozen ditch full of disabled vehicles, a scout reported seeing a man in an oil-stained greatcoat prying open the engine cover of a BT-7. He worked without gloves, no rifle, just a box of tools strapped to his chest and a small flask tied around his belt. When the scout approached, the man waved him off. "There's time for talking after," he said. "Let me fix it first." The scout looked away for a moment, long enough to hear the rumble of a misfiring engine lurching to life. When he turned back, the man was gone. The tank had no crew, no markings, just a note scratched into the inside of the driver's hatch with a knife. "She still wants to fight, so I helped." That tank later participated in the final counter-assault against a German logistics convoy, credited with destroying 2 enemy trucks before stalling in a field and burning. No one claimed the kill. No one recovered the driver. But the engine block was still warm when Soviet infantry arrived hours later. Stories like that multiplied after the thaw. No photographs, no confirmations, just rumors. But rumors hold power in war, especially when the names fade, but the results remain. Field reports began, including strange line items, repairs done with no assigned technician, tanks returned to service with no requisition forms, fuel drums appearing beside engines that should have run dry. Men joked about a spirit in the snow, not a ghost of the dead, but the soul of machines too stubborn to quit, whispering in the ears of those who still believed that steel, even broken, could still serve. Some say Gerasimov lived until the end of the war, repairing tanks until the very last battle. Others say he died under his own machine, crushed while trying to realign a track plate that no one else thought could be salvaged. Still others believe he simply walked west, looking for more things to fix. What is known is this. Of the 137 tanks assigned to the Northern Corridor between December 1942 and March 1943, at least 38 were officially declared unsalvageable, and then, weeks later, were reported in active use again. No paperwork explains how, no mechanic's name is attached. Except once, in the corner of an old requisition form found decades later in a warehouse near Volgograd. Scrawled next to the line reading KV-1 chassis number 2726 restored field ready were 4 letters in faded red pencil. MG, nothing else. But for those who know, for those who keep machines alive long after they should die, it is enough. Because in the darkest winters of war, the rarest thing isn't courage. It's someone mad enough to believe a broken thing is only waiting to be rebuilt. They called it the iron whisper, the sensation, barely perceptible, that a machine was not entirely lost if someone still remembered how it worked. That idea had survived long past the battles, buried not in archives but in fingertips. It was passed down in stolen minutes between tank crews, in field briefings, in stories told by old men with burn scars on their forearms and the quiet gravity of those who had once pulled breath from rust. They didn't tell tales of valor or heroism. They talked about torque ratios improvised in freezing mud, gearboxes held together with prayer and fencing wire, radiators repaired with boot leather and bits of a German helmet. And always, always, the same name came up, spoken in a mutter, never written down. Not as a boast, not as a legend, just as a mechanic who, when everything was gone, built motion from nothing. In a post-war repair depot outside Kursk, a junior officer reviewing the service history of recovered vehicles noted something unusual. Tanks with serial numbers, declared non-operational in late 1942, showed wear patterns consistent with use well into the spring of 1943. Treads had been replaced, drive shafts remounted, engine compartments reconfigured, but no records showed official repair orders. No parts had been requisitioned. The tanks had simply kept going. When he asked a senior technician, a veteran with a limp and eyes too sharp for his age, the man just nodded once and said, "Some of us fix because we must, others because they cannot stop." The officer didn't understand, but he stopped asking questions. Because somewhere deep down he recognized what could not be explained, and that's how the story lived, not as doctrine, as vibration. In 1975, a museum in Minsk received the partial hull of a T-26 light tank found submerged in a bog. It was barely intact, more rust than steel, but inside the transmission housing, investigators found a non-standard bearing assembly made of carved wood, partially soaked in linseed oil and wrapped with cloth. The curator dismissed it as sabotage or field improvisation. But an elderly man in the restoration crew pulled the piece aside and examined the fiber wrap. Under years of grime and rot, he found initials carved into the wood. Not a name, just 2 letters. MG. He didn't tell the curator. He simply nodded to himself and whispered something in a dialect not heard since the front froze. On все еще держится. He still holds. Somewhere in the ruins of that impossible winter, men learned what it meant to resist through repair. To fight not by breaking, but by refusing to let what was broken stay that way. They spoke in voltages, pressures, alignment tolerances. They found religion in compression, and in their quiet cathedral of tools and heat and frozen blood, they kept the war alive one machine at a time. Gerasimov never asked to be remembered. He built nothing designed to last. He wrote no memoir. His sketches were destroyed. His shed collapsed. His bones, if they were ever buried, are now indistinguishable from the slag of 1943. But when a machine starts again that should not, when wheels turn that no longer have tread, when the last drop of fuel gives just enough spark to move a turret left and fire once more, that is him. That is what remains. Because sometimes the greatest resistance is not defiance. It is function. No one designed the battlefield to be fixable. War was a system of destruction, not preservation. It devoured everything: fuel, men, steel, time. Yet there were those who moved through it not as warriors, but as healers of machines, as if the clatter of gears and the hiss of pressure valves were pulses to be restored, not replaced. And in the long thaw after Stalingrad, when spring turned the frost into mud and the charred remains of too many failed offensives sank into the soft earth, the few tanks that still ran told the story no report ever captured, that someone, somewhere, had made the impossible run. In a letter recovered from a field medic's journal, addressed to a wife who never received it, there is one line written shakily in pencil. "They say there's a mechanic who fixed a T-34 with a door hinge and a cooking pot. I didn't see it, but I saw the tank roll past and it waved at me with the barrel like it knew. No signature, just another name lost in snow. But the testimony held. Even in rumor it was clear. The work had power." Years later, during a lecture at the Kazan Military Engineering Academy, a professor paused while discussing Soviet wartime manufacturing shortages. He turned to the class of young cadets and asked them if they believed a tank could be made to run without a single new part, only pieces scrounged from destroyed enemy units, farm machinery, civilian scrap. The room was quiet. One cadet laughed. The professor didn't. He picked up a small, twisted coil of metal from his desk and held it up. "This," he said, "came from a German MG-34. It was found inside the starter mechanism of a KV-1 that survived the winter at Stalingrad. The records say it shouldn't have worked, but it did. Because a man chose to try." The room stayed quiet after that. One cadet wrote the words down on his cuff. Another kept the story in his head for 20 years before telling it to his own son, a tank technician in Chechnya. And so it continued, not through legacy, through ignition. In 1999, an expedition team recovering rusted armor fragments from the Volgograd region unearthed a section of drive sprocket welded crudely with what appeared to be a makeshift brace. Forensic analysis showed that the brace had been fashioned from a scythe blade, ground down and riveted into place with spent shell casings. No formal engineering logic explained how it held, but it had. The sprocket bore wear marks indicating at least 30 kilometers of active use after repair. The lead technician on the recovery labeled it Field Repair Number 5 in the report. Then in a private notebook he wrote, Gerasimov perhaps, or someone with his hands. There was no footnote. There didn't need to be, because by then everyone who had studied the strange miracle of Soviet survival in the winter of 1942 to 43 had heard whispers of the mechanic without parts, the man who fed tanks with fragments, who made gears from ghosts, who listened to steel and responded not with orders but with tools. Even today, in the design halls of armored vehicle development programs, engineers sometimes scribble equations on the whiteboard and end up facing a design flaw that no modern software can resolve. And one of them, without meaning to, will mutter, "What would MG do?" It's a joke, but only because the answer is terrifying. He would find a way, not the correct way, the working way. There is a noise that only a damaged engine makes. Not a mechanical failure, not a clean shutdown, but the slow, tortured sputter of something that wants to live and no longer remembers how. Mechanics know this sound, the way a surgeon knows the difference between a wound that bleeds and one that screams. Gerasimov knew that sound intimately. To him, every failing engine spoke. Each compression cough, each grinding delay in the flywheel, each uneven oscillation of the idle gear told him exactly where to touch, where to hit, where to dig. His gift was not vision. It was hearing. In the ruins near the river Volga, a field medic recalled a night when a broken tank was hauled by horse sled into the repair zone. The tank crew had abandoned it, assuming the engine block was frozen beyond repair. But Gerasimov had waited. He sat with it. He pressed his ear to the hull, ignoring the cold, listening. For almost an hour he sat motionless, and then he stood up and said, "No, it's just sleeping." He began repairs immediately. Within 3 hours the tank was operational. The crew, now reassembled, drove it back to the line and held a position long enough to evacuate 3 wounded units. The tank became known as Spastia, the sleeper. But that's not what he named it. On the inside of the maintenance panel, etched with a rivet head, Gerasimov had scratched 3 letters, Živ, alive. This was his method. Not logic, not plans, not doctrine. It was faith. Not in God, not in nation, not even in victory, but in motion, in utility, in the ability of parts to still fit together, even when they came from different machines, different eras, different enemies. If a piece turned, it had value. If it could be shaped, it could be made to serve. At some point, his improvisations surpassed practicality and became something closer to art. There were tanks on the front lines with parts made from bed frames, tractor wheels, German canteens, railway nails, melted cutlery. One KV-1 bore a replacement armor panel fashioned from the door of a civilian bakery, still painted in Cyrillic, now warped from heat and bolted over a ruptured engine housing. That tank was struck by a German 50mm shell. The shell glanced off. The door held. In the museum where that tank would one day be displayed, the plaque says nothing about Gerasimov. It doesn't need to. His fingerprints are still fused into the handle rivets. In the post-war years, when engineers and historians tried to compile the material history of Eastern Front innovation, they ran into a wall. Not because the data didn't exist, but because so much of it had never been recorded. Repairs had been made not by central command, but by hands, not filed in ledgers, but etched into the steel of machines that were either destroyed in combat or repurposed beyond recognition. No paper trail, no technical logs, just machines that ran when they shouldn't have, and when survivors were interviewed, drivers, loaders, gunners, they all said the same thing. He fixed it, I don't know how. He pulled it apart, growled at it, hit it twice with a wrench, and it worked. I didn't ask questions. When the engine started again, I cried. That was the legacy he left. Not instruction, proof. The war ended, but not for the machines. Some were melted down, others left to rot in forests and fields where no one dared recover them. But a few, a strange, silent few, survived. Not the pristine, parade-worthy tanks of propaganda reels, but the scarred ones. The ones with holes welded shut with forks, with treads linked together with barbed wire, with engine mounts refitted with rifle barrels. Machines that breathed when there was no breath left, and in those hulks years later, researchers would find his handwriting. Not full sentences, just fragments, pressure values, tolerance measurements, ratios penciled directly onto bulkheads, weld lines scored with a letter or a symbol, always in the margins, always hidden, but always there. Some were marked with a single scratched phrase, "Zdelano is nevozможно," made from the impossible. In 1983, a museum curator in Yekaterinburg received a donation from the family of a deceased tank mechanic. Inside the box was a folded wool coat, a set of hand tools blackened from years of use, and a bundle of schematics drawn on what appeared to be old flour sacks and German propaganda flyers. The diagrams were brilliant, rough, irregular, but full of real field modifications. One showed how to use the spring from a captured Luger pistol to replace a ruptured tension coil in a T-26 idler arm. Another diagram demonstrated the rerouting of coolant using parts from a samovar. The curator asked if the name of the mechanic was known. The son said only his nickname. The officers called him Chert, the devil, not out of fear, out of awe. There is no official photo of Gerasimov, only memories. A few testimonies collected late, long after their usefulness to the state had passed. In one, a retired major said, "I saw him once, thought he was a partisan, covered in soot, carrying a fuel injector like it was a child, said nothing, walked past, fixed the tank, left." Another witness said Gerasimov only ever asked one question when someone came begging for a miracle: "Will it fight?" If the answer was yes, he went to work. If no, he turned away, not out of cruelty, out of principle. Machines were sacred to him only when they served life. There are places in Russia where the frost still comes early, where the wind pushes against the land like the breath of the past. In those places, sometimes, an old man will glance toward the tree line at dusk and mutter a name when he hears the sound of an engine coughing in the dark. They say it still happens, that someone is out there repairing what cannot be repaired, fixing one last machine for one last fight. Not because it will turn the tide, not because it will win the war, but because no engine should die before it's given the chance to try, because even the dead steel of a forgotten tank deserves one more breath, one more roar, one more impossible repair, because Mikhail Arkhipowicz Gerasimov, the man with no rank, no medals, no record, proved that sometimes the only difference between a wreck and a weapon is someone who refuses to give up, who refuses to wait for parts, who refuses to call anything beyond repair. Sometimes what keeps a war machine alive isn't strategy or logistics or command. Sometimes it's just one man, one wrench, and a terrible, beautiful kind of madness.